Welcome to the latest podcast of the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C., Russian News Decoded. We watch Russian news so you don't have to. My name is Andy Kuchins. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C., where I also teach at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, in Washington. I'm your co-host, and today with me is Chris Monday, my co-host, who is an economist based at Dongseo University in Busan, South Korea. By the way, before I turn it over to Chris, I want to note that music that you heard at the intro, which should resonate with some of you, that is the intro music to the Soviet news show Vremya from about 1986. And that is the intro that we're using for Russian News Decoded. That does resonate with me. Anyway, Chris, how are things in South Korea?
Great, and welcome to the podcast. I think it's such an important topic, and if I could, just a minute, tell you why. Last year, I went up my mountain workout. I had a great workout, and got some great mountain water. Came back home in the evening to relax. Turned on my internet, and I saw we have martial law here in South Korea. So it was exactly 1 year ago, martial law was declared. We still don't have an explanation for why. Some say the president then, President Yoon Suk-yeol, that he just kind of went crazy. Maybe, but my opinion is that he got overwhelmed with the situation between North Korea and Russia. North Korea is out supplying Europe with military shells. And the feeling might have been, he could help out and cause some, provocations here and suck North Korea out of Russia and back here. Of course, that's disturbing because, we have about 20,000 U.S. troops stationed here. You're talking about a major war. I would not count out that martial law could have been declared in my country, in the United States, which would have helped the Biden out. We definitely have to be mindful that this conflict in Ukraine can spread to other regions. And I feel it almost spread here to South Korea. So that's why I feel very strongly this podcast is very important.
Wow, that's pretty bizarre, Chris. Here we are a year later, and there's been no official explanation as to why martial law was called, or justification as to why martial law is continued now for 1 year.
Yoon Suk-yeol, he declared martial law, and thankfully, that very night, the Koreans, they stood up. They stood up. I was here. It was just universal. The people who support conservatives, liberals, they did not want it, and they got rid of it. They got rid of it. They backed down. And Yoon Suk-yeol, he's now in prison with his wife. But it was just, we have no explanation why this happened. I just find it very hard that it was just one guy, just maybe he just went crazy. But I think something else might. I'm convinced that Russia was a factor. He was worried about the Russian-North Korean alliance for sure, and that might have factored into it. Also, disturbingly, there have been some fires in the data centers, so a lot of the data, the proof is all gone. So I'm not sure we'll ever know the true story, but I'm convinced that Russia was a factor in this.
Well, I can't blame him for being nervous about this nascent, especially then, 1 year ago, nascent Russian-North Korean alliance. The meeting of Kim Jong-un and Putin that took place in June of 2024, if I recall correctly, was it was bizarre to watch. I've never seen Vladimir Putin certainly as happy as he was. And of course, the implications, it doesn't take much to imagine how nefarious Russian-North Korean alliance could be. But let's return to our mission today on Russian News Decoded. Essentially, Chris and I are veteran watchers of Russian and Soviet news, and we still watch it regularly. And we are convinced that one can learn a tremendous amount about how Russians are viewing the world, how they view their place in the world, and how they are explaining it to their citizens and to the rest of the world. So, what we do is we riff off of the weekly news roundup show hosted on Sunday evenings, typically about 2 hours and 20 minutes, hosted by the master spin doctor of Russia. Yes, Dmitry Kiselyov, who's about of the same generation of Mr. Putin and most of his comrades in the kind of
Yes.
modern day Politburo. And as this week, Kiselyov, the first thing he said that we've had a насыщенная неделя, a full week, a full week indeed, according to Mr. Kiselyov. And if it's okay with you, Chris, I'll start saying a few things about maybe the biggest topic of the week before as well, and that is the so-called Trump peace plan, Plan Trumpa. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are to meet with Vladimir Putin on Tuesday, December 2nd. By the way, we should let you know that we are recording on the evening of Monday, December 1st. We try to record as soon as possible after the Viesti Nedeli show. And of course, Witkoff, Kushner, and Marco Rubio, they met with the Ukrainian delegation headed by Rustam Umerov on Sunday, November 30th in Florida. And as Viesti, spins the peace plan, Putin leans a bit forward, yet he is basically non-committal. He made extended remarks in Bishkek, where he had a 3-day visit for the Collective Security Treaty Organization meeting, the CSTO, or ODKB, in the Russian acronym. And there was a number of bilaterals also in Bishkek. We'll have more on that later in the podcast. Now, Putin intimated in Bishkek that the process has quite a ways to go. He put an interesting the teams need to sit down and agree on many, many details, sort of typical diplomacy, a typical peace process, which so far this peace process has been anything but typical, I would say. And then he put an interesting spin on the definition of occupied territory, stating that if the Ukrainians left occupied territory, then there could be peace. If not, we will use military force to get them out. Now, of course, this so-called occupied territory in the Donbass is legally Ukrainian territory. But since the Russians have claimed Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye Oblast, and now they've even entered into Dnipropetrovsk, or at least Vesti correspondent Vadovin stepped into the region very dramatically last week. But this is the basis in which the Russians make their legal claim, having run the basically illegal referenda in those 4 oblasts 3 years ago. So it looks to me, Chris, like the Russians, they don't really have any incentives to move quickly on the peace plan. I think more mid or longer term, I do see some significant incentives for them to do it, but not anytime soon. So I kind of expect them to continue to run out the clock, play the four corners offense, if you remember from the 1970s in North Carolina. But we will have a better idea after the Kushner-Witkoff visit in Moscow tomorrow. What's your take, Chris?
Yeah, thank you. So Putin, of course, he studied in Soviet times at the law faculty in Leningrad, with the international section under Sobchak. And we see when Putin, you can kind of tell when he's happy. And he's very happy in this kind of where he's talking about the law and, that basically what he's doing. And so he was using Western law to fool the foreigners. That's what he learned. And that's what he loves, is using, some legal terms and technicalities to pull the wool over the eyes of the foreigners. And we can see he's very happy. He has his stance where his he's back to the old days where he has his legs spread out, very macho style. We see also in the news, very important, is this new cult of personality. I mean, it's getting towards Stalin level, where Putin, we see him everywhere. He's ubiquitous. He's deciding everything. Putin knows. They keep repeating that. Putin knows everything. He's thought everything out. 100 moves in advance. I mean, and they're clearly telling the domestic audience, It's Putin who will decide. He could decide there's peace, make a peace plan with Trump, and that'll be good. Or he could say, and he's sitting, and Putin says it himself, well, we'll just continue the war. It's no problem. We'll just continue. But Putin will decide, no one else. And I'm sure we'll talk later in this program. He's been very threatening to anyone who, Lavrov seems, we don't know, he seems to have disagreed. He's out. And, other opponents, there's definitely a menace there. You do not question this. So I mean, and then he's also showing the West. It's going to be Putin's decision. He could go either way. You give him a good deal, and he give him a very good deal, and he'll accept it. You don't, and he's going to just tear through. That's at least what he's projected. Now, I think there's some bluff there. I think there's some bluff.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Chris, in that he is in his element right now. He is feeling confident and cocky. It was quite a dramatic backdrop, by the way, on that press conference in Bishkek. It looked like it was a huge painting of the very picturesque and spectacularly scenic Lake Issyk-Kul. That would be my guess because it's sort of a sacred ground in Kyrgyzstan. But having watched Vladimir Putin quite closely now for 26 years, he is as on his game as I've ever seen him. And I think he feels like he's the master player with the marionettes, various puppets, and he can pull different levers, almost like remember the Wizard of Oz, except for Putin's levers actually may do something. Anyway, it's a little dangerous to see him. But Chris, in the background of all this, there's the huge corruption scandal in Ukraine. It's widening with the big news on Friday,
Yes.
November
Mindich
28th, of the forced resignation of Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's longtime Uber aide. Why don't you take that one first?
Yeah, so of course the Russians are playing this to the hilt. I mean, they've just got a real win here. The Russian news, they're very careful to first play the Western spin. So it's the Westerners saying, "Oh my gosh, there's so much corruption and the golden toilet, and it's just Yermak, just the money's flowing out." They show the Western press, and this is very indicative because it's basically showing what they know the Russians don't believe their own news. They know their own news isn't believable. And so they have to first put the Russian news, the Western news, which I was criticized. They have to always show that because that they know that's what even people in Russia, that's what they'll believe. They'll believe something from the New York Times, but they don't believe Vesti themselves. So there's some hypocrisy there. Also, we saw that this was earlier in the week, a very interesting report. Sergei Pashkov, he's one of the few good journalists. He was in Israel, Tel Aviv, and he went into Mindich, what he claimed was Mindich's house in Israel.
And Timur Mindich, of course, is the central figure so far targeted in the corruption investigation, who fled Kyiv for Israel probably about an hour before he would have been arrested.
Yeah, and so supposedly right next door is Kolomoisky, Igor Kolomoisky's house. They showed. Of course, they don't say this. They don't say it. They're very careful on the Russian news. But I mean, of course, there's an anti-Semitic connotation that it's these Jews are stealing the money and they're hoodwinking the poor Ukrainians, and Russia's helping out basically to get rid of this kind of menace. And then, of course, there at least for me, there's some questions. How did they let Pashkov into his house doing this? I think it's also signaling, that the Kremlin's getting some help from abroad. They're in cahoots now with Trump. Trump's ours. Trump's helping us out. We're no longer isolated. I don't think the Israelis just let Russian journalists just walk around. So these houses, that was disturbing. And then, of course, Yermak, the Russian news since the war started has pointed to him as a key insider, they call him the Gray Cardinal, the Gray Cardinal, this inside intriguer figure. But the Russian news depicts him as as a clingy up and comer guy that, he doesn't deserve his post. He was some producer, kind of sleazy producer, according to their view. I don't think this is quite true, but some sleazy producer who just got there through some corrupt schemes. And then,
like Putin, lawyer by training.
Yeah, and then of course I think he had some KGB ties also. But
yes, certainly his father.
There's a lot of rumors about him. But the way the Russian news is spinning it is he's this kind of incompetent guy that got there for corrupt means. And then this is very important. The Russian news insinuate that there's a kind of homosexual relationship between Zelensky and Yermak. And this is a tip of this goes way back, and for Putin, this is a hallmark of Putin, as he really lets it go with his propaganda. It goes back to Saakashvili. The Russians, they made a pornographic movie with Saakashvili and Yulia Tymoshenko. And so this sexual politics that sexually degrade your opponent, to show there's the corruption. The Ukraine is corrupted from the inside. There's the Jews, of course. The Russia, you always have them. And then, of course, there's maybe some sexual deviance or something going on from the Russian side.
This is better than the protocols of the elders of Zion.
They don't say it out. Sorry, they don't say it outright, but this is, unconsciously, this is all.
It's all understood. Then they also this segue into a somewhat different theme, but it's just remarkable to me how once again the Europeans are so demeaned on Russian news. And it kind of starts with Putin's comments in Bishkek regarding the Mindich Gate scandal. I mean, who is teaching whom? More than implying that the Europeans are just as corrupt as the Ukrainians. And then Putin takes on the huge paranoia across Europe these days, perhaps excepting Hungary and Slovakia, that the Russians are going to attack soon. And this is a real thing. This is a real fear in Europe now, more than I've frankly ever seen in my life, including during the Cold War days, where I've spent a fair amount of time in Europe in the 1980s. So the fear is real. Putin denies this, and he dismisses those talking about it as zhuliki.
Hysterical.
Yeah, hysterical crooks. And he says, it makes no sense for Russia to do this. Why would Russia attack Europe? Well, I would say that one could have said the same thing about Russia invading Ukraine 4 years ago. Why would they do that? And then there's the fact of the Russian cross-border drone overflights into a number of European countries, NATO members, for the last month or so. Putin is often extremely disingenuous. Sometimes he just flat out lies. This is a case of just being totally disingenuous. And then this leads to an attack on one of Russian news's favorite foils, once again, Kaya Kallas, who was quoted as saying that Russia had attacked 19 countries in the past 100 years that had never attacked Russia. Well, you can imagine that, Russian news had a field day with this one. Certainly, there was no mention made of Germany, for example. But that's just one dig at Ms. Kallas. They ridicule NATO head Mark Rutte going to Iceland to urge them to increase defense spending when Iceland actually doesn't have any military forces. And they also make, I think, a quite serious point, Chris, and talking about the budget difficulties of most European countries and the difficulty they would face in giving up on social welfare programs, cutting pensions, and basically making the point that there is no political will in Europe to mount much of a military threat. And by the way, virtually all the European leaders have very low ratings. with Mr. Macron bringing up the rear with sometime in the past year a rating of 11, approval rate of 11. And Russian news also never hesitates to present gender bias particularly against female European leaders. And again,
Sexual.
Miss
Yeah.
Kallas, the former Estonian prime minister and currently the high representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, is repeatedly shown ringing her little bell like a schoolmarm running the EU meetings. Like, okay, class, students, come back to your desks. We need to start class. That is what it evokes. And Russian news, they love to repeat videos of European leaders, women with women, women with men, giving the little Euro double peck on each cheek, accentuating really how it looks rather effete. And the message is clearly is that, these people, these Europeans, they are just not serious. An old theme, but it's the Brookings Institution has a biweekly call with about 40 to 50 so-called experts. And today, some people were making the point that, well, what the Russians really don't want is they don't want the Americans to be involved in the development of the Ukrainian economy. And I'm just not so sure about that. I get more of a sense that the Russians really despise the Europeans and they feel like they've been stabbed in the back in a way. And they would perhaps they would rather see the United States involved in Ukraine rather than Europe. Chris, let me turn over to you for another story in the news, and that's the investigation of the Krymsky Most terrorist act. Well, from the Russian standpoint, the bombing of the Krymsky Most, and then the segue to an old enemy of the people, the the foreign agent, Mikhail Borisovich Khodorkovsky. Take it away.
Yeah, so this goes way back. For Russians, there's just an arsenal of images of these, the nefarious foreign agents. So in this one, they're showing, well, I mean, every day they show that the Ukrainians, they have these sneaky attacks. They're not, it's not like they're real men. They're not fighting us on the battlefield. They can't, they've lost. And so it's a sneaky attack. They blow up, some building with old women or the bridge, and everyday Russians suffer, old man suffers. They're tricking little kids to blow up buildings. And so, who was doing this? So of course, Ukraine, the United States, but it's also, there's an inner enemy. That's the main thing. There's an inner enemy. There's traitors amongst us. They could look like us. People look like us. They show old men or children, housewife. Anyone can be a traitor. Any of them. And who is behind this? It's not just the clueless Americans. It's one of us. There's Khodorkovsky. And so, of course, Khodorkovsky, I remember I was in Russia at this time in the 90s. He started Yukos, kind of one of the first modern companies. He was one of Russia's, one of his most wealthy men, but he had a kind of bad reputation. And as they show in this, so as Mamontov, a notorious journalist, he has an expose on Khodorkovsky where he shows he was getting involved in politics, sponsoring the politicians, pulling the string. The Jew, is Jewish, pulling the strings. And they show, these clips of the horrible 90, how horrible it was in the 90s when the Americans, they let the Americans run things, not the Russians. And this Khodorkovsky, he was getting involved in all these things, pulling strings, killing people. And then he they don't talk about his the repression and things, but he just he was abroad, and now he's from abroad. He's still pulling the strings. So I mean, this goes way back. Of course, there's the Trotsky. Under Stalin, there was the Trotsky conspiracy, where I mean, there really were Trotskyites, but it was just blown out of all proportion. Where I mean, anything that blew up or broke down, that was a Trotskyite that did it. And of course, the Russians know this is one message for the viewers is, there could be another repression like under Stalin. They could, if you're not using Max, not using the Kremlin Kremlin certified, phone applications, then you could be, Trotskyite or Khodorkovskyite, Ukrainian terrorist, and you'll go to prison. They'll punish you. There's a horrific kind of, thing they show, like everyday Russians. They show them. They say, Khodorkovsky nafig, which of course is a euphemism for, a very vulgar Russian, fuck off type thing. And then he says, "Это не наши люди. They're not our people." So who is not our people? Of course, it means the Jews. They're not our people. So it's a very nationalistic thing, and they're
Well,
showing.
Chris, I was actually quite close to the whole Yukos affair and to Khodorkovsky. When I came to the Carnegie Endowment in 2000 from Stanford, the first day on the job, I remember May 15th, 2000, the first guest speaker that I hosted was Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
Oh wow!
And then 3 years later, just before I went to Moscow to take over the Carnegie Moscow Center for a few years, we actually we signed a contract with Yukos to receive $1.5 million, $500,000 a year, starting that. I think the first payment was in June of 2003. And I arrived in August of 2003, and already the attacks on Khodorkovsky had been going on. I'll just tell you one anecdote I hosted Khodorkovsky at the Carnegie Moscow Center on June 1st, 2003. I believe it was his 39th birthday, if I recall correctly. That day, Khodorkovsky was the wealthiest under 40-year-old in the world. He was the richest man in Europe. And he was talking to us about what he saw as the future of the oil industry. And he had a few little slides, and one of them said, today, the oil industry in Russia is valued at about $75 billion. Our projections suggest in 2007 that will be 300 billion. So I'm listening to him going, okay, so 4x that. And puts him somewhere, 35 to $40 billion. And then he says, we also want to get into the gas business. I'm thinking, holy mackerel, the gas business at that time was way more undervalued than the oil business. And so I'm thinking, by 2007, I mean, this guy could be the richest guy in the world. And then he tells us, seriously, he did this. It was a closed meeting, supposedly Chatham House rules, but 40 to 50 people in the Carnegie Moscow Center. There's a listener in there. There are probably microphones. He says that he plans to get out of the oil business and become more active in public affairs. I'm going, wow, this guy is insane. He's basically telling us that he does want to become president. So he did really present a threat to Putin. And I just thought, you are insane, buddy. You think you can beat the Kremlin? I really don't think so. And of course, 3 months later, he was arrested on October 25th of 2003. And that was quite interesting as well. He was traveling around in Siberia, and where they got him was in Novosibirsk. And they seized him while he was supposed to be getting on his airplane. But for the previous 3 days, there had been a lot of footage on Russian news about his trip. And honestly, Chris, it looked like a political campaign. It really did look like a political campaign.
Yeah.
I think he knew that he was toast. And then the next day, after the arrest of Khodorkovsky, just to get back to your point about the fear of 1937 and the purges and the Stalinist terror, that immediately the liberal opposition, which was a lot bigger in those days, was talking about that. And it was kind of amazing to me how quickly it sort of moved seemingly from the back of the brain right to the frontal lobe. It goes right there.
Yeah.
All right. At any rate, so the foreign agent Khodorkovsky is back, the old enemy of the people, once again up to his old tricks. Okay, I want to go to the
So this is very important for us. Very important because it shows it's telling the Russian populace, and especially it is a message to the oligarchs. You don't get involved in the peace process. This peace process is decided by Putin.
And you don't get involved in politics, period.
Yeah. And we won the war. Putin says we won the war, then we won the war. Putin says we got to go fight, then we got to go fight. You keep your head down. There's not going to be another Khodorkovsky, and of course, Putin's got to be worried that the art of the deal, that other oligarchs will start traveling to Florida and start making side deals. So he's saying no, don't. This isn't going to happen.
I wouldn't advise that. Let me transition back to Bishkek for a bit. I spent 3 years in Bishkek as the president of the American University of Central Asia from 2019 through late summer of August of 2021. There was absolutely no news whatsoever reported actually about the CSTO meeting. No news whatsoever about it. But what we did see a lot was a lot of pageantry, a lot of yurts, a lot of falcons, a lot of brightly colored dancers, ethnic Kyrgyz music, and of course, lots of menace oral history chanted through the loudspeakers. And then on the as getting off the airplane, Putin, there is this group of Kyrgyz guys dressed up in like ancient Kyrgyz military uniforms, probably going back to the epoch of Manas, the golden period of Kyrgyz history, more than 1,000 years ago. And I just want to note how the Kyrgyz, which actually means 40 tribes, along with Arabic and Muslim soldiers, turned back the Chinese Empire in the 8th century in a battle on the current-day Kyrgyz territory near the city of Talas. Now, of course, this is not mentioned on Russian news. That's just my local color of it. And that marked actually the furthest west the Chinese Empire ever got into Central Asia. Okay, enough of history. Well, there'll be more history later, of course, because Russian news loves to get into history. Russians love history. They love history. They love geography, unlike Americans. Any rate, so current leader Sadir Japarov is shown speaking in quite good Russian with Putin, claiming that Kyrgyz, quote, is part of the Russian world. The official procession for Putin's arrival going down Chingiz Aitmatov Street, named after the most famous modern Kyrgyz writer, who, of course, as Russian news points out, wrote in Russian. Ethnic Kyrgyz school children in Russian language classes. Russian support for Russian language schools. So the presentation is of Kyrgyzstan, what the Soviets used to call Kyrgyzia, as kind of Russia's happy little colonial outpost in Central Asia. Let me just make a sidelight on Japarov, because I was there in October of 2020 when there was, where in 9 days, he went from being a prisoner in jail. In 9 days later, he was the prime minister and the acting president of Kyrgyzstan. And Kyrgyzstan had one of their not so infrequent so-called color revolutions. They're not really revolutions. They're just coups d'etats, because in a revolution, the system changes. But that's not what happens in Kyrgyzstan. It's an endemically corrupt country. At any rate, Japarov became president. Now, what's kind of relevant maybe for us, and maybe going down a rabbit hole here myself right now, is that Dmitry Kozak, Putin's fixer in those days for many things happening in the so-called near abroad, the former Soviet republics, he arrived in the middle of this. And it was clear that the Russian position was they did not want to see the current president thrown out of office. They were happy for Japarov to become the prime minister. But no, they didn't want to see a color revolution. The Russians never want to see a color revolution. But actually, that's what happened. And this was the same, the summer of 2020. The Russian position was lost in Nagorno-Karabakh in the Azerbaijan-Armenia war. Of course, there were the weekly huge demonstrations in Belarus. I mean, it really looked like Russia was on
They
its
were on the back foot.
on their back foot, on their heels. Let's turn from
Can I say?
Yeah, sure.
So I have a lot of love them Central Asian students, and they pointed out this was huge for them. Was they all say this? So it's last year when Putin wasn't doing as well. This was Jomart Takayev of the president of Kazakhstan. He addressed Putin in Kazakh,
Yeah,
and
that's
this was
that video.
stunning. This was
It's a
stunning for
classic
them.
video, and it's the whole Putin and the Russian elite are there, and Tokayev starts speaking in Kazakh, and they're just going like,
Yeah.
"What the fuck going
Yeah.
on?"
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean this is typical Putin where he's the point of this is to rewrite history. One it's a slap in the face of Trump. He's showing Trump, who's the man here. You're not going to do anything in Central Asia. This is just not going to happen. I'm the man here. I'm the guy, right? In Central Asia. And then they're showing they're going to bring back it's going to be part of the Russian sphere. And then, of course, I don't. This is the rabbit hole, but of course, the Eurasianists. There's a lot of people that in Russia that have this Eurasianist philosophy that our destiny is with these kind of with the land. It's a
Right.
whole the land, and they showed Tian Shan, the mountain. They said the river. I mean, that was clearly a sop to these Gumilev type Eurasianists that think Russia's special path is connected to this land,
Well,
kind of more mystic.
while we're on this Eurasian trek, Chris, why don't we turn further east to Asia, where this week Khabarovsk was featured, the so-called Khabarovsk process, and the Sino-Japanese war, the current Sino-Japanese flap argument over Taiwan, and current Japanese debates about moving from the three non-nuclear principles dating back to 1945. Last week it was Murmansk that they were featuring late in the show, and this week it's Khabarovsk.
Barbados.
This is in your neighborhood, Chris.
Yeah, so this goes back to my introduction. Sorry, but we watched these things here in Asia. I mean, this was a terrifying report, just terrifying. So what they showed was that the history that the Japanese that of course there were war crimes, especially biological. The Japanese had developed biological weapons,
Some really
and
gruesome
so
photos and
yeah,
video.
and they show just horrendous. So they say that they said this that the Japanese were worse than the Nazis, were worse than the Nazis. For Russian news.
That's
And
bad.
just horrific pictures. And then they show the so-called Khabarovsk trial. This is under Stalin, Stalin justice, 1949, where they prove, that there are these biological weapons.
Kind of
So this
like a
is
Soviet
important.
Nuremberg.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Soviet Nuremberg. And then, so this is important because allegedly this is again the Russians, and then of course the Chinese and North Koreans is very important. They're all on board on this idea that these Japanese bioscientists went to Fort Detrick and created the American and we did have a bioweapons program. And then, these bioweapons, they were used in North Korea. So North Koreans, they have a museum, they have a special room where they show the American bioweapons, the crimes of the Americans. And so this cannot be by chance. This week, Kim Jong-un, he visited that area and he had, it's almost word for word, the same things Kim Jong-un is saying that
Wow.
he said the Japanese, and the Americans, the occupiers, the Mijay, are so savage. Our minds can't believe it. They enjoy watching people die. And Kisilov, he said, I mean, almost word for word, the same thing. The same thing. And the Russians right now, they're in Pyongyang right now making these deals. I mean, that can't be by chance. But anyway, so there's these bioweapons, and then let's go back 2022. What is the reason Putin gave for the war? Is of
Yeah.
course the Americans are developing bioweapons facilities in Ukraine. We have to stop it. That's why I have to do the war now. That was his reason.
The
This is
Ukrainian Nazis and their bioweapon
yeah,
lab.
This is a major. This so on Russian news, it's on and off. But I mean, this has been going on for years. This bio for decades. The bioweapons theme, and we have proof. We have archival proof that this was all agreed on by Mao. You know, this goes back to Stalin and Mao's time. They worked out this propaganda line. So they're bringing this back. They're showing, you know, we have a good line against the West, and this is synchronized with North Korea and with China. And then, so this is just completely terrifying. They show the Japanese, the warmongers. So they show this. I mean, in here in South Korea, this is still very controversial. They show, of course, you know, Hirohito and the shrine to these what Chinese and South Koreans consider war criminals. It'd be kind of basically like a shrine to, you know, Hitler and Stalin, Hitler and Himmler, or, you know, something. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, you know, kind of like that kind of idea, right? Like if you
So
see
I
them,
think I think they're the story here is very closely tied, of course, to the recently the new Japanese Prime Minister Kanai
yes,
Takaichi, who
yeah,
made the comment essentially that has become a huge diplomatic row with the Chinese. She simply said that if China were to take uh, Taiwan and by military force, it would be a major threat to Japan. And that has launched all of this. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that this week, clearly, the Russian news comes out 100% on the side of China,
I
of
will.
this Asian theater. And and then they kind of to close out the news, almost close out, they have a very old looking Igor Sechin, and this kind of ties the knot on the Khodorkovsky story,
Yes,
CEO of Rosneft,
that's not by chance. No.
of course it's not, and the instigator of the Khodorkovsky affair and the destruction of Yukos starting in 2003. He's giving a speech in Beijing for Russia-China Energy Week or something like that. Like, so, Chris, I want to turn to you for
And then they don't show that all at the same time that sections there. Alexander Novak is also he's in
yeah.
Pyongyang cutting the same kind of deals. This is very serious.
Well,
This is
it's
very
funny
serious. This
there
is
was
a
no
signal. This is a signal they're showing that
there.
we're after Ukraine. We're gonna move in Asia.
It's kind of odd that there was no mention of North Korea at all this week, but I think it could well be back next week, given the visit you were talking about. But I want to turn to the new holiday, Mother's Day,
Yeah.
uh, founded by our favorite Anna Putina's organization, Защитники
Yes.
Отечества, Defenders of the Fatherland. Tell us a little bit about the new holiday, Chris.
So this is again a long-running propaganda theme. Of course, during the Chechen War, a key opposition group were the mothers of the soldiers, and that Putin has worked hard to shut down any type of civilian veterans groups, and this is an attempt to do that. So he has his niece Anna Tsivalova. She's on the news at least once a week. She was back again this week with highly proctored videos working with the veterans. And here they don't show her this time, but I mean, clearly she's behind this. Is she's working with these mothers, very highly emotional. They show the mothers of a fallen soldier or a wounded soldier, and they show how the government is really caring for the veterans, caring for the relatives, caring for the parents. And Anna Tsivalova, she's a trained psychiatrist. You know, she makes no bones about her specialty. She's just a perfect person for the situation. She shows how she's working with the common people,
You
and
may be the perfect person for
earlier
a
in the
lot of
week.
things, Chris. You may be the perfect person for a number of things.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll talk more
And
about her another day.
yeah, but the earlier this week they show her, working. these very effective scenes where she's working with the veterans, to help them.
Very emotional.
Yeah, very emotional, and shows that ties in her defense minister post and her specialty as a psychiatrist. For Russians, this is a big thing, and of course in the future, someone who can combine the civilian and military aspect. I think that's what'll be needed.
So we will certainly return to Anna Putina Sivalyeva at another show, but I want to take the show out with the dog that did not bark last week but did bark this week, and that I'm referring to the drone strike on November 29th on the oil export terminal in Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, as well as the strikes on Russian oil tanker Shadow Fleet ships in or around Turkish waters. Now, there was a strike on the oil export terminal 2 weeks ago, which was not reported on Russian news. We talked about that last week, but this one they did report, as well as the strikes on the ships, which is interesting. And they noted how the Kazakhs are very upset about this because 80% of Kazakhstan's oil exports go through the Caspian pipeline to Novorossiysk and then to the rest of the world. The Turks should be upset about this, they're intimating. But,
Yeah.
it's not immediately clear to me why they reported on this strike, but not the one 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, as we discussed last week, it did appear that the Russians tried to retaliate with their own escalation in the attempt to blow up a Polish rail line that's the next day that serves as a key corridor to send Western equipment across the border into Ukraine. You got a thought on this, Chris?
Someone out there might be watching our show, uh, but I would not count that out. But of course, yeah, this one it's showing that these attacks, what they do is the effective attacks they don't show. The sneaky attacks, the underhand attacks, something that hurts civilians, everyday people, that they show. So here it's like, they're in their last legs and they can't do much. And so,
Desperate.
they bomb some old ships and civilians are hurt. That's the West, is just they're vicious people, so that ties into these propaganda lines. Oh, what was not mentioned is, of course, Venezuela. There's no mention of Venezuela. So I said, there's rumors out there that some deals are being cut. This might substantiate that. I mean, they're not. They could make a big deal out of Venezuela, and they're not saying anything. So
Well, there's like last week, there's nothing in the show that could be construed really as an attack on the Trump administration. And that may help to explain the silence on Venezuela while it's a very controversial issue in the United States, as well as in Latin America at large. At any rate, we have been on with you for a long time. It's been a great pleasure for me. And Chris, thanks so much for joining me again this week. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Remember, we're the guys that watch the Russian news so that you don't have to. Russian News Decoded. And we're going to send you out with one of the most famous modern pieces of music ever written. All right. Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.